Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Max Orr. I'm joining you from the delightful and lovely Peel Gallery here in Carborough, North Carolina. Peel Gallery is a wonderful facility. It'll be open in a month. We'll talk more about that and drop in some links on this wonderful site. You here are here, of course, for Carolina Public Humanities presentation of another wonderful Gerhard Weinberg seminar, the World War II in the Pacific. We are delighted to welcome you here today. I want to thank a few people before we begin. Certainly the Cotton Market Group at Morgan Stanley have been underwriting our programs for a number of years, especially our K-12 programs. Carolina Meadows, a wonderful retirement community here in Chapel Hill, have been wonderful supporters of our public programming and recently have come on to support also our K-12 programming. Very thankful for their support. And of course, our partners at the General Alumni Association, who have always done such wonderful work promoting and putting on great projects with us. So we're delighted to have their support. Certainly want to encourage any of you who are not members of the General Alumni Association to sign up for that great organization. You don't have to be an alum, in fact, to be a member of the GAA, and it does provide wonderful discounts on all sorts of programs, including several of our offerings as well. If you don't know what Carolina Public Humanities is, who we are and what we do, we're the public outreach arm for the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And it's our job to make sure that the excellent scholarship and faculty of Carolina are shared with the state. And we do this, of course, through a variety of programs. These programs here are Adventures in Ideas weekend seminars, which normally we hold with rooms full of people. And can greet you live. They have been our flagship program since 1979. And of course, we are continuing with those today. We have our Humanities in Action lecture series, a wonderful series of talks on contemporary, perhaps controversial topics. And those occur on Wednesdays at 3:30, one-off lectures. Of course, our wonderful Great Books reading groups and language lunches. And we even have a new program on Friday afternoons from 12 to 1, lunch with friends and strangers. It's a biography series. It's a wonderful way to sort of get an in-depth look at interesting people from throughout the historical record. So these are a lot of our public programs that we have. Of course, we're doing everything virtually until we just can't stand it anymore. We're all ready to be live again, but we're very happy to be able to do this virtually. But soon enough, you'll see that we also have things like cinema schools, even live music performances, and we can't wait to be able to do all of our events live and virtual with you in the future. In addition to our public programming, it's important that you know that Carolina Public Humanities is reaching other communities, including our K-12 teachers. And we do that through Carolina K-12, our subsidiary organization that organizes teacher workshops throughout the state for teachers to get access to this wonderful faculty and scholarship, and a really extensive community college and state outreach program in which we are partnering with those institutions throughout the state, again, to bring this faculty to them and to provide wonderful synergies and interdisciplinary opportunities for faculty and students and community members at our various community colleges around the state. If you would like to help us in our mission, we know certainly you are paying ticket prices for our public programming, but if you'd like to help us in our initiatives, especially with K-12 teachers and with our community college outreach, we are a lean, mean fighting machine. We do everything here on a small budget. We could use all the help we can get. So feel free to give. I think Paul is putting in the donation button there. Certainly, we appreciate donations of any size, and all donations are tax deductible. I have a few upcoming programs I want to mention briefly. Our next Adventures in Ideas seminar will be on the weekend of March 5th and 6th, and that will be a wonderful look at religious freedom. Well, I don't know if it's wonderful, a tricky topic, religious freedom around the globe. We also have another Adventures in Ideas seminar later in March on what we can learn from animals. And yes, there's a lot we can learn from Zen little critters that they are. We have, of course, our Atom Symposium coming up in the middle of April 16th and 17th, and philosopher Elizabeth Anderson will be joining us from the University of Michigan, and she is going to be giving a wonderful talk on the work ethic. What does the Protestant work ethic mean for the 21st century? So look at all of our other programs. Next Friday, we have lunch with friends and strangers with Matt Andrews and Muhammad Ali joining us. And of course, Humanities in Action and all of our wonderful good programs. Paul keeps dropping wonderful links into our chat here. That should give you plenty of background. Let's get right to the event we all came for today. We are delighted that we get to work with Gerhard Weinberg. It's one of the great honors of Carolina Public Humanities to be a forum in which Gerhard feels comfortable coming and talking to y'all, as we say here in North Carolina. Gerhard Weinberg, as you know, is a distinguished professor of World War II history. We can drop his bio in here, but he really needs no introduction. Having been the author of World at Arms, perhaps one of the greatest single volume histories of World War II, and several other titles, Visions of Victory. He needs no introduction because he's our dear friend, and we're just honored that he continues to work with us so graciously. So without further ado, I'm going to stop talking and let our esteemed colleague, who is across the way over there. We got a little technological thing we're going to work out here. He's literally about 50 feet from me over here through the magic of technology. So without further ado, please welcome Gerhard Weinberg.
Thank you. Good morning. I will be talking about Japan's strategy in the Pacific War and how that, under pressure, changed. In the years before the war, Japan had already begun a program of expansion. Had begun by seizing areas from China, Manchuria in particular, and a piece of North China in 1931, had then gone to war with China and conquered substantial further areas. What they particularly wanted for further expansion were the islands in Southeast Asia and India and Burma, in particular the Dutch East Indies, because that's where they could get oil. In 1940, the Germans, in their war in Europe, after crushing Poland in alliance with the Soviet Union, had conquered Norway, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. As the Germans had difficulty with the British, they suggested to the Japanese that with the owners of these areas they wanted, either already defeated or, in the case of Britain, trying to save themselves in the Battle of Britain and concentrate troops in England against the German invasion, this was obviously the time for Japan to take all of these places. The answer to this suggestion from Tokyo was, oh yes, we plan and hope to do that. But in 1946, the Germans, top leaders, realized that that date, 6 years into the future, was not arbitrarily picked by Japan, but was related to the decision of the United States Congress to pass a law under which the Philippines, the major possession of the United States in East Asia, would become independent in 1944, and the United States would give up its bases in the Philippines in 1946. So obviously, the Germans understood that the Japanese did not want to send their forces into Southeast Asia with the Americans on their left flank, They wanted to wait till the Americans got out and they could take the Philippines while they were at it. The German response to this was, if you go now, and also, as you will have to, attack the United States, we, the Germans, will immediately join you in that war. Since the Germans were expecting, the German government, the Hitler government, was expecting to fight the United States and did not have the time to build up its Navy and Air Force for that. But the Japanese, they knew, the Germans knew, had a good-sized Navy, so they might as well let the Japanese do the fighting with the United States for them. It was under these circumstances that the Japanese had to rethink their planning. They had thought about the likelihood of war with the United States for many years. And in the 1930s, had realized, as the Germans had, that they would have to cope with the Navy of the United States, the Germans in the Atlantic, the Japanese in the Pacific. And without consultation between them, both had come to the same conclusion, that under various international treaties, the main armament of American battleships was limited to 16 inches in diameter of the big guns, and obviously then of the shells. What they would do, independently decided in Japan and in Germany, is build much bigger battleships that could carry 18-inch guns and destroy the American ones at a distance that before they could even start shooting at them. The Japanese planned to build 4, as I should add the Germans did too, of 70,000 tons, about twice as large as the American battleships of the time, and carry 18-inch guns. As a practical matter, they scrapped one while it was being built, converted one of the other 3 into an aircraft carrier, the Shinhanon, and ironically, years later, when it was moving from after launching, it was moved from one Japanese port to another, an American submarine sank it. But 2, the Yamato and the Musashi, were finished, were completed, and would be in the war. As they looked to this war and would begin it, they assumed that they would win initial victories and that thereafter they could negotiate a peace with the United States that would let them keep a lot of what they had conquered. It was their judgment in Tokyo that since the areas they planned to conquer were colonies of European powers, the Americans, who had gotten their independence by fighting the Revolutionary War against England, and who were generally opposed to colonialism would be prepared to make a compromise peace. This is a subject I will come back to because it was a major miscalculation to which I'll return. The early plan for war with the United States assumed a major naval battle as the Americans tried to rescue the Philippines, which they still controlled. It was Admiral Yamamoto who insisted on a change. He insisted that Japanese aircraft carriers could approach Pearl Harbor and there, in a surprise attack, crush the American fleet, much of which had been placed there in the hopes of deterring Japan from war. And then, with the American fleet in the Pacific destroyed, not only could Japan quickly conquer what it wanted to conquer without interference from the Americans, but in addition, that would give the Americans a further incentive to negotiate a peace. In the summer of 1941, and this is a subject I will come back to when I talk about American strategy, there was long debate, but eventually those who argued for war won out in the Japanese government, as Yamamoto, by threatening to resign as commander of the fleet, won out. And as I'm sure everybody knows, on the 7th of December, 1941, the Japanese initiated war with the United States by attacking Pearl Harbor. And I'll come back to the Pearl Harbor attack in a moment. Thereupon, both Germany and Italy also went to war with the United States. The attack on Pearl Harbor, and I'm now asking you to look at it from the Japanese point of view, turned out to be both a strategic and a tactical error. The assumption that the Americans would never want to pay or be willing to pay the price in blood and treasure to retake from Japan a bunch of colonies of European powers. If you look at the Pacific map, you will see these are all what they were planning to conquer, somebody's colonies. This was a complete miscalculation. With the slogan, "Remember Pearl Harbor," Americans, not just leaders, but the American public was absolutely determined to crush the Japanese. Going further, and I will come back chronologically, but I would like for a moment to show you the most dramatic illustration of this strategic error by the Japanese. In the course of their advance, they conquered the island of Guadalcanal in the Solomons. The Americans, for strategic reasons, landed there and fought what would be the longest battle in American history, from early August of 1942 to the middle of February 1943. During that half year of bloody fighting, nobody in the United States argued, well, Guadalcanal was a British colony. Why should we reconquer this island for them? And when we were successful, and the Japanese in mid-February of 43 evacuated their last soldiers from Guadalcanal, it became a British colony again. And I recall myself as a teenager at the time following, as did all Americans, either newspapers or radio, this endless bloody business. Nobody ever argued that it didn't make any difference to the United States which colonial power held this island, excuse me, that no American knew about, cared about. No event in the war can more clearly show the strategic error of for the Japanese of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Americans were going to crush them, however long it took and whatever it cost. There were also tactical errors in this. As the Japanese knew, Pearl Harbor was rather shallow. With two exceptions, all the battleships that they attacked were raised and restored to duty. It may have been just as well for Yamamoto that he'd been killed by a deliberate American attack on the airplane he was in, when in a naval battle off the Philippines, all the American battleships except one had been so-called sunk in Pearl Harbor, but had been repaired and returned to service. The other, I'm asking you to think of this from the Japanese point of view, tactical error of the Pearl Harbor attack was that the overwhelming majority of the crew members survived. I do not want to disregard or minimize the over 2,000 who were killed. But this was in the harbor on a Sunday. Many of the crew members weren't aboard, and even the ships that were hit, including the two that could not be returned to service, the Arizona and the Oklahoma, lots of crew members were saved. This is a very different situation from the usual one when a warship goes down at sea. Earlier that year, 1941, the British battle cruiser Hood had been sunk in the Atlantic. Two of its over 1,500 crew members survived. And when the German battleship Bismarck was sunk a few days later, of its crew of 2,400, 130 survived. The survival of the crews of the American warships in Pearl Harbor is usually disregarded in the literature, which stresses the repair of the ships and the American building of lots of new warships. What is overlooked in that is that both the restored battleships and the new ones needed crews. those were long-term disasters for the Japanese. To begin with, they advanced. They conquered Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, lots of islands in the Pacific, all the way down to here, Guadalcanal that I have already mentioned. But that took a long time, especially in the Philippines. Until early May of 1942. But as they continued to move, the next thing, obviously, is Australia and then New Zealand. And the way they figured to do that was not only from bases here, but Australia from the conquest of a base, Port Moresby, on the south coast of New Guinea. It was in this effort that they were halted in the Battle of the Coral Sea in May of 1942. Under those circumstances, while they would periodically still bomb Australia, Australia was safe, even though some of its soldiers were fighting with other British soldiers, alongside of other British soldiers in Africa. If you couldn't do it down this way, at least you could expand in another direction. You could hope to enlarge what you had already conquered by taking Midway Island as a base for taking the Hawaiian Islands. And you could also hope, as the Japanese did, to annex Alaska and Western Canada by starting at least in the Aleutian Islands. So in the summer of 1942, instead of concentrating either on a campaign here or a campaign there, the Japanese decided to do the two simultaneously. They managed to conquer Attu and Kiska very easily, but American intelligence had broken into the Japanese code, and we knew they were headed for Midway. In early June of 1942, the American Navy, although numerically, please note, very much smaller than the Japanese attacking navy, was successful in what is usually called the Battle of Midway. Yes, the Japanese bombed Midway But before they could land and take it and use it as a base to seize the Hawaiian Islands, the American aircraft carriers launched enough planes with at least enough accuracy in bombing and torpedoing that 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk, and a very high proportion of their experienced crew members were lost. 1 American carrier, the Yorktown, which had been damaged in that battle in the Coral Sea that I mentioned a few minutes ago, had been repaired and was then sunk as a result of a submarine attack. But this crushing defeat of the Japanese Navy in the Battle of Midway caused a basic change in Japanese strategy. It was obvious that having crushed the Navy, the likelihood of the Americans agreeing to some kind of a compromise was much lower than the Japanese leaders had expected. They, if you will, got about halfway towards realizing that the Americans were going to keep fighting. The Japanese, under those circumstances, made some new strategic decisions. And the one that was most important, at least in my personal opinion, and the one that they would hold on to until August of 1945, was to raise the cost, especially in lives, to the Americans, to the point where the original notion of the Japanese would be, if you will, indirectly implemented. That if in every single case where the Americans moved, the Japanese could raise their cost, especially in casualties, in lost American lives, at some point in there, the American people and the American military would call it off. And the Japanese would continue battling in Burma, in China, and in every island that the Americans could think of landing on and did land on. They would also try to take over India, and they had some Indians recruited out of prisoners taken in Malaya who would fight alongside Japan against the Allies on the assumption that Japan would be, as a ruler, would be better for India than the British who were ruling it at the time. As the Americans, and I'll talk about that in my next lecture, struck a double offensive across the Pacific, Central and Southwest. The Japanese fought for every square inch of territory. And I would repeat what I've already said, but in a specific way. If and when you read detailed accounts of the Pacific War, you will come across the names of islands like Eniwetok and Tarawa that you've never heard of before, and that in practice nobody in the United States really cared about. But we landed and fought for every single one of them. And the Japanese fought for each one, not because all Japanese wanted to take their summer vacations on one of these little islands, but because running up the cost in casualties for the Americans might at some point lead them to call it quits. Again, I would suggest to you that the most dramatic example of the total error of this strategic concept was the fighting for Okinawa. Let's see if we can get that up here. Over here in the Ryukyu Islands, south of Japan. The battle lasted 3 months. Was the costliest battle of the Pacific War in terms of casualties. But the general atmosphere in the United States was, if that's where we have to fight the Japanese, that's where we'll fight the Japanese. The concept of a negotiated end to this war, as there had been in the prior end of World War I, or the subsequent Korean War, was something that the American public, in support of the decisions of the president and the American government, never was willing to consider. The other aspect of this was, as I've mentioned, continued fighting in China. And when the Americans were helping the Chinese to try to control and block aid to them, and in an offensive in the summer of 1944, take the bases from which American airplanes could fly from China to Japan. You will need to recall one very important difference between the American war in Europe and the American war in the Pacific. The moment we were at war in Europe, because the Germans and Italians had declared war on us, we could bomb them from bases in England to begin with, and in North Africa soon after. But bombing Japan, we had done that once from an aircraft carrier, that famous Doolittle raid in April of '42. But generally speaking, all you got to do is look at the map. unless you could do it from China, you had to get to islands that were close. No other way to get there. What this means, in effect, is that our bombing of Germany begins in 1942, but our serious bombing of Japan begins in 1944. The Japanese had some other concepts in the years after, excuse me, their defeat at Midway. And these were all designed, I think it's fair to say, or most of them were, to discourage the Americans. Some Japanese submarines went off the coast of California and shelled American cities on the coast. In the latter part of the war, this new strategy involved an aspect of the submarine campaign that nobody else had ever dreamt of. The Japanese built submarines that carried airplanes inside. And when the submarine surfaced, it would put the planes, take them out of the submarine, put them on the water and take off, and bomb the United States. In particular, later on, the Japanese figured they would destroy the locks in the Panama Canal so that American troops would have a difficult time getting from Europe after beating the Germans. They'd have to go around South America. Furthermore, they decided to take advantage of the fact that in the Pacific, the wind blows eastward. And they built thousands and thousands of balloons to which they attached explosives and firing devices, and sent at least 9,000 balloons across the Pacific to hit Western Canada and the Western United States. As you probably know, both in Western Canada and the Western United States, there are very extensive forests. And the Japanese concept was that if these firing and explosive balloons don't land and damage cities, they will hopefully start enormous forest fires. These thousands of balloons caused a few fires and a small number of casualties, but proved to be, on the whole, I think it would be fair to say, a waste of resources. More recently, as you may or may not know, the Arabs in the Gaza Strip, a part of the territory that the Israelis conquered in the 1967 war and then turned over to the Arabs, decided to follow this Japanese strategy of sending fire-causing balloons into Israel. While that was, if you will, a technical success, they could do it, it proved something they didn't learn from the Japanese experience, and that is that the American public saw this balloon fire starting operation as an incentive to fight harder to crush the Japanese. It in no way influenced people, especially from the American West Coast, to urge the government of the United States to make a compromise peace with Japan. The Japanese also were working on atomic bombs because of the very difficult relationship, generally bad, between the Japanese Army and Navy. They had two atomic bomb projects. The Army had one, and the Navy had one. The central control of the Army one was in Tokyo and was destroyed in one of our big air raids of Tokyo in April of '45. The one of the Navy was developed in Korea, the northern part of Korea. I'll come back to the atomic bomb issue when I talk about the United States, but I have to share a personal story that perhaps you might want to follow. When individuals with whom I talk, or audiences, or in audiences before I speak, argue against the Americans dropping the two atomic bombs, I ask them, do you really think we should have waited until the Japanese dropped the first atomic bomb on Seattle, San Francisco, or some other American city? It is a side of this whole issue that is generally ignored, but tells us something about the Japanese strategy in the war. While they were developing these atomic bombs, they also conducted some very large offensive operations. In 1944, as I've already mentioned, in China, and in 1944, a major one in Burma. They tried counteroffensives in the Philippines after the Americans landed there in the fall of '44, and also a couple of times in the Marianas and other islands in the Central Pacific. As I've already mentioned, they fought for Okinawa for 3 months. It's the only campaign, major campaign, in which the American commander was killed, as well as the Japanese commander at the end committing suicide. You have probably seen the picture of the American flag raising on the island of Iwo Jima, a tiny island important for its airbase, which cost the United States people thousands of casualties. They were also planning for the invasion of the home islands from the Americans and others. I will discuss the American plan for the invasion of Japan in my next talk. But what is, I think, very interesting is that the Japanese, without espionage or code breaking, had figured out pretty much what the Americans were going to do. We generally, in prior operations in the Pacific, as the Japanese knew, had first tried to get someplace close to the main landing of whatever it was, so that there would be local bases for air support of the major operation. They had therefore figured out that we would first land on the southern island of Kyushu and would then go to Tokyo Bay. They therefore started developing defenses there. The ones on Kyushu, the southern island, were far advanced. Those in Tokyo Bay were just beginning. And I recall when I was in the Army of Occupation in Japan, a friend and I one weekend drove to the area where, given our age, we would have probably been replacement soldiers for the American landing. And as we saw, looked at the beginnings of the Japanese fortifications, we very quickly agreed that it was much better to look at this from the land side than from the sea side. The decision of the Japanese, in other words, that is critical here is that they will once again believed that running up the casualty cost colossally for the Americans would lead the Americans to agree to some kind of an armistice. We'll come back to this later, but it was agreed in Japanese governing council that defending the home islands against an American invasion, whether or not that invasion was supported by other allies of the United States, Japan would and could take 20 million casualties. In other words, approximately a quarter of the whole population. We will come back to this issue subsequently, but one has to see the development of the war in the Pacific in the light first of Japanese initial conquest strategy, with the American fleet hopefully removed, either originally by a big naval battle or subsequently, at Yamamoto's insistence, by an attack on of the ships on its base. But when that all didn't work, it was thereafter the basic strategy was to make the cost for the American people so high that they would call it off and make concessions rather than go into Tokyo itself. Thank you. And now it's time for your questions and comments.
Gerhard, first of all, Paul, can you hear me on the microphone? Okay. Gerhard, can you hear me back there?
Yes.
Okay, we have plenty of questions for you. Welcome, everybody. First of all, we have Doug Anderson has asked, As one of the few Japanese naval officers that had direct experience with American culture, I think he means, did Yamamoto fail to correctly estimate the impact that a sneak attack would have on American public opinion? Did Yamamoto, should he have been able to predict that American public opinion would be tougher on the Japanese attack?
He shared the general view at the top. It's one of the few things, in fact, where he shared views with the other Japanese leaders rather than forcing them to his point of view by threatening to resign. On this issue, there's no evidence that Yamamoto saw this differently from the others. And the impact of the Pearl Harbor attack, which was deliberately, at his insistence, in peacetime on a Sunday in port, was from the technical point of view, had some things from the Japanese point of view were advantageous. But even from the tactical point of view, as I've already mentioned, had very serious defects. But from the strategic point of view, was a hopeless misjudgment. And while it is correct that Yamamoto had been in the United States, the notion that a sneak attack on a Sunday in peacetime would rally everybody in the United States didn't occur to him.
Great, thank you for that. Jim Leggett is writing us from Mississippi. Welcome, Jim. Jim asks, how successful was Japan in taking advantage of the oil and other resources from its initial conquests?
It was, in fact, Japan was, on the whole, quite successful in this regard for the first couple of years. Many of the, especially oil refineries, had been destroyed before the Japanese conquered them. But on the whole, in the early years of the war in the Pacific, the Japanese did get rubber, nickel, oil. But then, starting really in 1943, something changed that hurt them. The United States went into World War II with torpedoes for its submarines that didn't work. They either ran at the wrong level, exploded in the ocean before they hit anything, or didn't explode when they hit something. It was not well into 43 that our submarines got torpedoes that worked. And, of course, interfered with the Japanese, who obviously had to bring everything in by ship. Furthermore, as the Americans advanced, and eventually in October of 44 landed in the Philippines, they were able, with airplanes, to interfere. So that in the first part of the war, it's fair to say, Japan did benefit some from the conquered areas with raw materials. In the latter part of the war, this came to be less and less and less.
Great. Thank you for that, Gerhard. We have a question from Anne. Do the Japanese refer to the battles by the same names we use? Is it the Battle of Midway, for example, for the Japanese?
To the best of my knowledge, they don't. In some instances, they do, but in many instances they've developed rather early their own names.
Thank you for that. I have a question here from John McQuaid, board member of Carolina Public Humanities. Welcome, John, from out in New Bern. The question John asks is, did U.S. intelligence know about the Japanese atomic bomb project?
The United States knew very little, practically nothing, and after the war suppressed what little it knew, and what little after the war it found out. And the Japanese themselves did, at the end of the war, as much as possible to destroy the evidence. And so there is, even today, I mean that literally, argument as to, for example, those who argue that the Japanese working the Navy project that was working in North Korea, and that would help the Russians develop theirs, and the current government of North Korea its, that in August of 1945, a month after the Americans tried out their atomic device in New Mexico, a month after that, in August, the Japanese tried out one in North Korea. There is lots of open questions still about that development, but there's no doubt that they had one. The Americans during the war knew very little about it, and most Americans, in effect, I'm talking about the leadership now, did not take it seriously. There is evidence, on the other hand, that Soviet spies found out about it. And this, as I will point out later on this afternoon, led to the Soviets being very eager to take over northern part of Korea, first by conquest and then by negotiations with the United States, to take up what nuclear advances the Japanese might have made there. And quite frankly, I have to tell you, I don't know whether Soviet intelligence, it's quite possible, got onto the Japanese armies working on an atomic bomb through its headquarters of atomic research in Tokyo.
Okay, great, wonderful question and great answer. We have a question from Bob Warren. Bob asks, can you expand on the impact of the Allies breaking the Japanese Purple Code?
I didn't quite catch that.
Could you expand on the impact of the Allies breaking the Japanese Purple Code?
Well, obviously, the Battle of Midway was the most important, as we look back on it now. Rochefort, working in Hawaii, was the contributor to this. The other way in which breaking Japanese codes was critical was that with the help of the Australians, we got shipping code. And that helped our submarines and airplanes destroy Japanese shipping. The whole issue of supplies from Southeast Asia and to the Japanese holdouts in islands in the Pacific were affected by the American intelligence from code breaking. I think it is also fair to say that, excuse me, we learned in the summer of 1945 from code breaking, the Japanese effort to get the Soviet Union either to arrange a peace with the Allies or in fact change sides and join Japan. One other way in which our code breaking was very important was that we were reading the Japanese diplomatic codes in which Japanese diplomats in Europe reported back. And the most dramatic example that I can cite on that is that when the Germans took a Japanese diplomat, particularly the ambassador in Berlin, on a tour of their defenses in France and reported on this to Tokyo, we in effect, the Allies, the Americans, and we shared this with the British, got the tour of German defenses against an Allied landing on the coast of France. So, and much of what we know about internal developments in Hungary, in Italy, in Romania, allies of Germany, comes from our reading of the Japanese diplomatic code from the reports of Japanese diplomats in those countries. So it was both militarily helpful and directly in the Pacific War, and important politically and militarily for the war in Europe.
Great, thank you. We thank you for that. And I also want to thank everyone for giving us a little bit of advice on what your screens are showing and whatnot. We do appreciate the feedback, and we're doing our best to make sure we avoid echo and whatnot. But let's get to your questions. Brian Keelef, hello Brian, asks, didn't the U.S. provide provocation by cutting off oil supplies to Japan in the middle 30s, and wouldn't that be the reason why Japan wanted to invade Indonesia?
We didn't cut off oil in the mid-30s. We sent them lots of oil all through the 1930s. The time, I mean, I will discuss some of this next time, but in the fall of 1940, the Japanese occupied the northern part of French Indochina in order to cut off supplies going from there to the nationalist Chinese. It was in the fall of 1940 when the Japanese shifted their emphasis from northern Indochina to southern Indochina that we realized this pointed, you don't get into China by going this way. Curiously enough, for a few millennia, China has been north of French Indochina. It was under those circumstances that we decided, why sell them the oil for their navy? The Chinese nationalists don't have a navy. What on earth do they need? Southern French Indochina and lots of oil. And in the negotiations in 1941, there is a very interesting aspect. The proposal is raised that if the Japanese will get out of southern French Indochina, we and the Dutch and the British will sell them all the oil they want. Thereupon, a message is sent from Tokyo to the Japanese negotiators in Washington that they are under no circumstances to discuss, to say nothing to discuss favorably, this concept that is, of giving up southern French Indochina and then getting all the oil they wanted. And it was this particular message, read by code breakers, that leads the United States leadership to send messages to Hawaii, the Panama Canal, and Alaska, that Japan seems to be determined on attacking the United States. They didn't need the oil for anything else. And if they were not prepared to think about giving up southern French Indochina and keeping only the northern part, the part adjacent to China, that was the decisive thing in the oil embargo. In other words, the decision to go to war with the United States comes before the oil embargo, not after.
Great, thank you for that. Alan Roberts asked, and Alan, you've been a great help. Thank you for all your help getting us our Zoom technology going. Alan asks, in perfect hindsight, would Japan have been better off exposing its presence either off of Midway or Hawaii to try to lure the Pacific Fleet into a sea engagement in December of 1941? Wouldn't their experienced aircraft carrier forces have been able to defeat the Pacific Fleet in detail at sea in December of 1941?
Of course, the original Japanese naval plan, which Yamamoto had dropped and substituted the Pearl Harbor count by threatening to resign. Whether or not an open naval battle engagement, which was the prior one, strategic, would have made big difference is very hard to say. Under the circumstances, would the Japanese have won or lost the big naval battle? It's very hard, frankly, to say how that battle would have gone. If they had won it, the war in the Pacific would have been very different in certain ways, but I am not persuaded that the final outcome would have been that different. But that's a speculation.
Thank you for that. I have another what if in the same vein from Owens Mengel. I assume that's two last names. The question is, what would have happened if our aircraft carriers had been caught in Pearl Harbor on that day?
Okay, one of the, if you will, a few lucky things for the United States of the Pearl Harbor attack is that our aircraft carriers weren't there that day. If they had been there that day, it is at least conceivable that the Battle of Coral Sea in May of early May of 42, could have gone differently. It is at least conceivable that the Japanese would then have landed on their force as planned on the south coast of New Guinea. Whether they would have taken Port Moresby, the key town there, or not, is hard to say. It's at least conceivable. The thing which, however, has to be kept in mind is that building up forces in Port Moresby for an invasion of Australia would have also required not only victory in the Battle of the Coral Sea, which is the immediate issue, it would also have meant required victory in the Battle of Midway. Could they have won the Battle of Midway if they had won strategically and not just tactically in Coral Sea? That's a very difficult one to answer. And one has to keep in mind that conquering Australia was going to not just take a port from which to go, but that's a fairly good-sized place, huh? And the Australians were going to fight, and we were going to help them, and the New Zealanders would be there. So things would have been different if the Japanese had won the Battle of Coral Sea strategically. But I'm not sure the war as a whole would have gone very different.
Thank you for that. And our final question, we had two sort of what-if questions for you. Our final question is a what-if about the present day. And the question is, do you think the United States of today, with its current political, social, economic, and cultural climate, would have the will to undertake the same sort of response it made to Japan's attack in 1941 if such an attack were to occur today?
I think the answer is that the American public would get together. What one needs to remember is that before Pearl Harbor, Americans were very bitterly divided. There were the interventionists and the isolationists. There were those who liked the New Deal reforms of the preceding years and those who hated them. There were those who favored some limited immigration and those who opposed any immigration. The country went into the war united by the Japanese attack. The slogan, "Remember Pearl Harbor," was critical. And it was also obvious not only that the Japanese had attacked us in a particularly mean way in peacetime, the Germans and Italians went to war with the United States. And then 3 other European countries, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, declared war on the United States. And I'm sure that there must have been people in this country who wondered, what on earth do they want to go to war with the United States for? And so people who were bitterly divided became very much united in the war effort. And I'm not so sure that we would remain divided as we now are. I don't want to argue that. If somebody pulled a similar stunt on us.
That is encouraging news, Gerhard. I know it's always tough when historians are asked to predict the future, but I think you did a good job there with predicting the future. We do have time for this short, so sort of a very detailed question from Alan Roberts, who asked, wouldn't the Japanese have had more carriers at Midway if 2 had not been damaged at Coral? Would the Japanese have had more aircraft carriers at Midway if 2 of them hadn't been damaged at Coral Sea?
We sank 1 at Coral Sea and damaged 2, and one of the 2 was at Midway and the other one wasn't. If the 2 had been there, it would have been more difficult. But Whether the whole thing would have been that different remains to be seen. Furthermore, if the two had not been damaged at Coral Sea, the Japanese would not have withdrawn from Coral Sea, but would have gone ahead and tried to conquer Port Moresby. Then the Midway situation would have been totally different.
Thank you for that, Gerhard. I want to thank, that's our first session, and we will be returning at 11:30 live here. Thank you all for helping us work through some of our digital kinks. This is the magic and beauty of the virtual world, is you get to hear echoes and see faces you don't want to see every once in a while, but we've figured it all out, and 11:30 we'll be back. We'll see you in a few minutes. Thanks, everyone.